Marriage is no longer a refuge. It has become a chessboard. The pawnbroker, imprisoning his wife within his own system, is unaware that he is actually trying to extinguish the spark within her soul. The man worships money and thrift. The docile girl worships generosity. The conflict erupts over a simple transaction at the pawnshop. A medallion, the memory of an old woman, is returned cheaply thanks to the girl's compassion despite the man's objections. This is the first blow to the pawnbroker's power. The man is furious because in his world, compassion is contrary to the profit-loss ledger. He declares his authority by saying, "The money is mine and I direct my life as I see fit." So do you think controlling a person's wallet is enough to rule their soul? Or does this only prepare the other person for an even bigger explosion? At that moment, the wild animal inside the docile girl awakens. Nervous breakdowns, stomping feet, and that poisonous smile on her face. The girl is no longer just a wife, she is a rebel. She pulls out the weakest point in the man's past, the fact that he was kicked out of the army for cowardice, like a sword, and points it at him. The question, "Did they kick you out like a coward?" destroys the pride fortress that the pawnbroker has built over the years. The man goes on the defensive, trying to prove that refusing the duel is an act of courage, but it's futile. As the girl's laughter echoes through the room, the pawnbroker drowns in the silence he himself has created. This is not physical violence, but one soul whipping another with naked truths. Imagine that your closest person knows your deepest wound and presses on it. The rebellion doesn't stop at words. The girl secretly begins to meet with the pawnbroker's old enemy, Yefimovich. The pawnbroker follows this betrayal like a detective and listens to them in a room behind the door. He has a revolver with him, carrying death in his pocket. But what he hears behind that door stuns him once again. His wife, that seemingly docile child, cleverly and calmly rejects the advances of a depraved man. The girl's innocence rivals the man's hatred. The man sees that his wife is not cheating on him, but this is no victory, because even though his wife remains faithful to him, she hates him. When loyalty becomes merely a duty without love, that home is no different from a prison. When they return home, a deadly silence descends. The man places the revolver on the table. It means, shoot me, shoot yourself, end this life. When he wakes up the next morning, he finds the barrel against his temple. The girl is standing over him, gun in hand. The pawnbroker closes his eyes and waits for death. This scene is the pinnacle of Dostoevsky's psychological genius. The man pretends to be asleep, but feels every second. He feels the coldness of the gun in his hair, but the girl cannot pull the trigger. Why? Because she is afraid, or because she thinks the man does not even deserve to die? The girl puts down the gun, and from that moment on, the marriage between them is completely severed in spirit. They are now two strangers, in separate beds, in separate worlds. After this incident, the girl falls seriously ill. She struggles with death for 6 weeks. The pawnbroker watches this process with secret satisfaction because his wife is now defeated. He hires the best doctors to cure her, sparing no expense, but his aim is more to make her more indebted to him than out of love. When the girl recovers, she becomes docile, as if covered in a layer of dead soil. But this is not the old sweet docility. It is the surrender of the soul. While the pawnbroker waits, thinking, when the time comes, she will come to me herself, he cannot see that with each passing day, they are getting a little closer to the precipice. When you are so sure of your own righteousness, how can you notice the silent disappearance of the person next to you? After the illness, a new order is established at home. But this order is not peace, it is a truce. The pawnbroker accepts his wife's docility as a defeat and secretly takes pleasure in this situation. He maintains his silence, saying, "I must give her time." But this silence is now a strategy, Even while claiming to love his wife, the man actually loves the psychological superiority he has established over her. He writes a heroic story in his own mind. He has saved her, cared for her, and now awaits her recovery. But this waiting is actually the final lock on the soul of the person opposite him. The man mistakes the dullness in his wife's eyes for docility. When a person sees the other's pain as their own victory, can we still speak of love? During this Cold War that lasts throughout the winter, the pawnbroker also comes to terms with his own past. The process of leaving the army hangs over his mind like a stain. The incident is actually simple. He remains silent in an environment where an officer friend was insulted and refused to duel. He calls what society calls cowardice a rational stance. But this wound has driven him to a pawnshop and a desire for revenge against people. His relationship with his wife is actually the rehabilitation of this tarnished reputation. If his wife worships him, he will feel noble, even if the world rejects him. How free is a man who ties his self-respect to another's submission? With the arrival of spring, the pawnbroker suddenly believes he has experienced an epiphany. He hears his wife singing softly in the room. This weak and fragile voice instantly transforms the narcissistic tyrant within the man into a loving man. But this is not love. It is a crisis of ownership. His wife singing, forgetting his presence, makes him feel he has lost control over her. He suddenly falls at her feet, saying he will take her to Bologna, that he will change everything. This is a false hope. The man thinks he can erase all his past sins with a single emotional outburst, but souls do not heal so easily, as if a key had been turned. The pawnbroker's sudden change and love attack marks the beginning of the end for the docile girl. She is afraid. The man's uncontrolled emotionality is more frightening to her than the old silence. The man's worship rituals are turning the girl into a statue. When the pawnbroker says, "Treat me like a dog, just let me look at you," he actually drags the girl into immense remorse. The girl's response is tragic. "I too hoped we would continue to live like this, as strangers to each other." This sentence is a reality that shatters all of the pawnbroker's Bologna dreams. Sometimes people wish to be forgotten rather than forgiven. The man's insistence and the rosy picture he paints of the future corner the girl. The pawnbroker offers to close the shop and start a brand new life. But for the girl, a new life means reciprocating the man's suffocating love. The girl is honest. She cannot love falsely. She cannot reach refuge in a half-hearted love. She is crushed under the man's nobility. At that moment, the shadow of the past completely swallows the present. The preparations for that fateful day when the man was 5 minutes late were actually completed with this false hope. Now stop and ask yourself, does the love you offer the other person give them life, or does it suffocate them under a burden of debt?
The pawnbroker believed that everything would be fine from the moment he fell at his wife's feet. For him, love is a moment of confession and surrender. But what he sees in the girl's eyes is not love, but deep horror. Could smothering a person with undeserved love be a heavier burden than physical violence? Faced with her husband's sudden generosity, the girl feels indebted and guilty. Now, obedience is not a refuge, but a prison. The man's dreams of Bologna, his passport preparations, and his plans to close the shop are not freedom for the girl, but the announcement of a new and more complex captivity. The girl is silent because words can no longer bear this weight. Have you ever thought of death as a way out, to escape someone's love? On the morning of that fateful day, the pawnbroker leaves the house for a short while. He wants to take care of the passport paperwork, to iron out the last wrinkles for their new life.
With songs of victory playing in his mind, he is unaware that the docile spirit he left behind is making its final reckoning. The man's 5-minute delay is one of the most tragic moments in literary history. 5 minutes, enough time to save a life or make a death eternal. As the pawnbroker walked down the street, he thought he had control of his life, yet control was always in the hands of the silent one. His wife, standing at the window with an icon of the Virgin Mary in her hand, was actually preparing to invalidate all the pawnbroker's power games with a single step. The moment she jumped from the window, it was not just a body falling to the ground. It was the collapse of the entire rational world the pawnbroker had built. The girl jumped with the icon in her hand. This detail is Dostoevsky's sharpest blow. She chose to go not as a rebel, not as a victim, but as a docile one. The icon is a symbol of her innocence and the justice she could not find in this world. When the pawnbroker comes home, he sees the crowd and that white silk dress on the ground. Time stands still in that moment. The man's mind refuses to accept it. He mutters, "She was here just 5 minutes ago. Everything was just beginning." But the truth is as clear as that cold, silent body on the floor. Why does modern man always realize the value of what he has lost 5 minutes too late? Now the man is alone with that lifeless body lying on the table. The narrative rewinds like an autopsy, dissecting each moment anew. As the pawnbroker tries to understand why his wife died, he actually confesses his own sins one by one. "I loved her," he says. But Dostoevsky asks us, who did you love, her or the power you wielded over her? The man's pain is not the pain of losing someone he loved, but the void created by the absolute power that slipped through his fingers. By dying, his wife has forever prevented the pawnbroker from reaching her. This is the harshest, most irreversible rebellion a docile soul can commit. Silence is no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard. If you've watched this far, I think you liked the video. It would make me happy if you subscribed to the channel and recommended it to your friends. Let's continue where we left off, in Fatih's Autopsy Museum. The pawnbroker is sitting at the table, talking incessantly. The body opposite him is silent. This is the longest and most one-sided dialogue in human history. The man thought his wife's docility was a weakness, yet that docility was a thin layer of snow on a volcano. Now that snow has melted and the burning truth beneath has emerged. As the pawnbroker shouts, "People are alone on earth, that is the real disaster," he is actually shouting with great anger on that deserted island created by his own selfishness. To truly love someone is to be able to tolerate their freedom. The pawnbroker couldn't do it. What about us? Do we imprison those we love in the cages of our own minds? Or are we brave enough to watch them spread their wings? Ask yourself this honestly and write your answer in the comments.
The sun was rising, but the darkness inside the room remained. The pawnbroker stood there at his wife's coffin, looking not just at a corpse, but at the meaninglessness of his own life. Dostoevsky leaves us at this point with the most poignant question: is love a desire for possession? The pawnbroker saw his wife's docility as a weakness, a territory to conquer, but that docile spirit, with its final move, rendered all these power games meaningless. The man now cries out, "People are alone on earth. That is the real tragedy." This cry is not only for the loss of a spouse, but also a lament for humanity being eternally trapped in the selfish cage it has created for itself. Now, be honest right here. How much freedom do you give the people in your life? Or do you only love them as long as they fulfill your needs? I wonder what your answer is. The man's cry of "I was only 5 minutes late" is actually a summary of his entire life. Those 5 minutes are not a physical span of time. They are an entire lifetime of delay in reaching another person's soul. When the pawnbroker questions why his wife committed suicide, he actually confesses her honesty. The girl could not accept the new and suffocating love her husband offered her, because this love was a false veneer covering all the silent torture of the past. His wife could not lie, could not pretend to be in love. Therefore, she saw death as the only way to remain honest. How many of us in the modern world are prepared to pay such a heavy price to remain honest? Dostoevsky's work is a salute to Victor Hugo's The Last Day of a Condemned Man. But here, the one being executed is not a criminal, but a docile soul. With these confessions, poured out as if being written by a stenographer, the pawnbroker is actually a court judging himself. When he cries out, "What do I care about your laws now?" he actually accepts that no social rule can ease his conscience. That handful of blood on the table has tainted all the pawnbroker's rational calculations, his dreams of 30,000 rubles. You can save money, you can gain power, but you cannot buy a soul. Now it's time to quietly leave the room, but the pendulum of that clock is still swinging, emotionless and stubborn. Tomorrow they will take the coffin away, and the man will be left alone in those 2 rooms with the pawned belongings. Dostoevsky leaves us not with a solution, but with a huge void. This story invites us to look at our loved ones. Do we really hear them, or do we only listen to their echoes in our own minds? If you have something to say to the person next to you today, don't wait for those dreaded 5 minutes, because some delays cannot be made up for in this world. When this video ends, you may want to remain silent for a while. This book is not just a story, it is an experiment that tests your moral compass. Are we part of the future, or are we destroying it with our own hands? While the advice to love one another echoes in the pawnbroker's empty rooms, we in this community, intellectual community, will continue to discuss not only books, but also the dark and light sides of being human. In our next stop, the classic Dystopia series, we will continue to examine the souls tamed by society. If you want to be part of this deep inquiry, join us and let's break this silence together. Because the real disaster is not being alone. It is not noticing the one beside you. Have you ever listened to the silence of a lifeless body lying on a table in the next room? What does that silence tell you? Perhaps this video is not just a book narration, but a thought experiment where you will face your own inner executioner. We are talking about wandering through the fragmented mind of a man standing before his wife's corpse. Could this be the story of that secret lust for power, that silent tyranny that you also carry within you? Dostoevsky doesn't just invite us to witness a suicide, he imprisons us in the docile yet terrifying arrogance of modern man who kills the soul he claims to love inch by inch. Is this book a story or a mirror that will shake you to your core? Now, as you look at that white silk coffin on the table, it's time to ask who really died. If you close this video, you will miss the most honest confession of your own darkness. Dostoevsky describes this work as a fantastic story, but make no mistake, it is not the events that are fantastic, but the form of the narrative. The author, like an invisible stenographer, transcribes the ramblings of a man whose mind is in turmoil. A pawnbroker, a former officer, an outcast from society, his pride wounded. His wife took her own life by jumping out the window a few hours ago. The man paces around the house, trying to gather his thoughts. But the problem is that reality does not always present itself clearly to people. The man sometimes justifies himself, sometimes blames his wife, sometimes becomes overly emotional. So, how honest are you when you look for someone to blame for the disasters in your own life? Or are you, like this pawnbroker, making up logical lies to silence your conscience? The story begins in a pawn shop. The pawn shop is actually a metaphor for power. That cold counter where people leave their most precious memories,
their family heirlooms for a few rubles. Our hero thinks he is taking revenge on society. He was once expelled from the army, accused of cowardice over a duel. This wound is so deep that he now sees the world as a battlefield. And then the meek girl enters the shop. 16 years old, poor, helpless, but proud. The pawnbroker realizes the moment he sees this young girl that he is looking not just for a wife, but for a slave over whom he can exercise absolute control. He chooses her meekness as his field of victory. Do you think love is liberating the other person or imprisoning them within your own system? For the pawnbroker, the answer is very clear. Power is everything. The man decides to rescue the girl. He pulls her out of her aunt's cruelty, out of the hands of a fat grocer. But this rescue actually opens the doors to a bigger prison. The pawnbroker even turns his marriage proposal into a show of power. He doesn't promise her luxury, only that she will be fed. He establishes his own system, the system of silence. I am a master of speaking through silence, he says. This is modern man's greatest weapon, to punish with silence. He wants to conquer the other person by leaving their soul in suspense, turning them into a mystery in his own mind. How many of us have not directed silence as a punishment towards our loved ones? How many of us have confused obedience with submission? This is where the tragedy begins. The pawnbroker expects the girl to worship him, to kneel before him for the pain he has caused her. But he forgets one thing. Docility is not soullessness. That proud core within the girl initiates a secret rebellion against the man's silent tyranny. That cold transaction in the pawnshop slowly seeps into the bedroom, the dinner table, every breath. While the man dreams of saving 30,000 rubles, he is actually digging his own grave. Now stop and think. Could the order you call stability actually be suffocating the person next to you? As we progress through Dostoevsky's dark labyrinth, we will understand that the pawnbroker's famous 5 minutes delay is actually a lifetime delay.